Okay. Everybody hear everything okay? Nod your heads.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Well, tonight we're talking about Pontiac. Everybody know who Pontiac is, and it's not the car that you once drove. That's probably where they got the name, was from Pontiac. But we're talking about Pontiac and the Obstinate Huron. None of us as Wyandottes have any idea what it's like to know somebody that's a little obstinate from time to time, that has a heritage that we all share. That seems to be kind of a character trait of a lot of Wyandottes, Hurons. So we're going to take a look at what happened with Pontiac shortly after the French and Indian War. So we're going to start off tonight with just a little bit of a refresher on what we talked about for the end of last month, just to kind of tie last month better together with what we're talking about tonight. But last month we saw where Colonel George Washington, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, on May 28th, 1754, he ambushed and killed a Frenchman. This Frenchman, Jumonville, was out basically in the middle of nowhere, near the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers. And he killed the Frenchman, a couple of other guys in his company, thinking that there's no way out in the middle of the boonies that it's going to be found out. But sure enough, it was. And that was technically the incident caused by Washington himself that began the French and Indian War on the North American continent. And as we saw, there was a game of chess that commenced almost immediately between the French and the British as they began to use the warriors of the various tribes as their pawns. They used the warriors basically to go out and do a lot of the things so that they wouldn't end up having to lose a lot of their very valuable, in their minds, soldiers, because they had to basically ship them across the Great Water, the Atlantic Ocean. On January 15th, 1755, British General Braddock began his little trip across the Great Water, the Atlantic Ocean, over to the American colonies. With him, he brought 1,300 troops. And as we saw, there was tons of equipment, multiple men and women that were there to support his expedition. And he was being dispatched by the king to specifically go and take on the French on the North American continent. And he brought with him 1,300 troops. The French basically were waiting with 637 Indians from various tribes, and only 254 soldiers of French descent. As we saw, the Battle of Monongahela was an overwhelming victory for the French and the Indian allies, which basically was achieved by the Indians because the French pretty much abandoned the battlefield. And we saw shortly after that that the Indians went basically out on a rampage. They struck the frontier. They went basically behind the frontier and struck settlements. They basically had an absolute cakewalk after the Battle of the Monongahela because there was no organized resistance to stop them. Unfortunately, the initial successes of the French and the Indians, it was pretty much short-lived. The British did have far more colonists. They had far more resources in North America than did the French. Unfortunately, they kind of thought that Braddock was going to come over here and spank the French pretty good, and it would be over in like 2 days. So they didn't really have themselves organized, nor were they unified in order to fight a major war. And they failed initially in doing anything good with that war. The French and the Indians, they were looking to basically have the short end of the stick and beat them pretty good, but it didn't work out that way. On November 29th, 1760, British Major Robert Rogers worked his way across the Ohio frontier, ended up in Fort Detroit, basically walked in there, took over the fort. And the French, without so much as a shot being fired, surrendered the French fort to the British, and the British now had a significant foothold right in the heart of Indian country. The problem was Rogers was unaware that there was this Ottawa chief by the name of Pontiac. And Pontiac basically showed up when Rogers did, demanding to know, why are you in my country? Pontiac was a very firm personality. He had a commanding personality to the point where he was just dominant among the other tribes. And he was just bold enough to walk right into the face of Major Rogers and demand he explain what's going on. Of course, Rogers didn't feel the need to do that. The Treaty of Paris was signed on February 10th, 1763, which officially brought an end to the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was just a small theater in North America of a global war that is commonly known as the 7 Years' War. That was fought primarily in Europe, but it also spanned North America and other places around the world. The French suffered a terrible defeat, and they lost much of their worldwide colonial possessions. They lost everything that they had in North America. The Spanish, seeing how bad that the French were doing, allied themselves with the French, came into North America, basically were defeated by the British as well. And the Spanish lost their possessions in North America, which is primarily how the British ended up with Florida. They took Florida from the Spanish at the end of the French and Indian War. Pontiac and Ottawa. And before we jump in here too much about Pontiac, I hope you guys can remember several of our other monthly discussions where there is a wonderful history between the Ottawa and the Huron, our grandmas and grandpas. And as we begin to jump into this, kind of think back to some of those discussions that we've had and see if you can remember what that relationship basically consisted of and how it looked like. And we'll get to it here in a little bit to see how this relationship is going to play out between the Ottawa and the Huron and Wyandotte now. So Pontiac was convinced that the French would soon return to North America. The French would come back in, take over their claim. Everything would go back to status quo. But before the French would come back, Pontiac was very upset with them. He was absolutely bored at the way that the French so easily surrendered the fort. They basically just turned it over to the British without so much as a shot being fired. Pontiac was also very upset with how the British didn't kill their French captives. It was kind of a tradition with the Ottawa and most of the other tribes in North America that once they actually defeated an enemy, they eliminated that enemy. Most of their enemies were killed either on the battlefield or when they surrendered, they were basically sacrificed, burned at the stake, whatever it was that they did. But the British did not do that to the French, and Pontiac was completely confounded as to why that didn't happen. He was also very confused as to why the British allowed the French colonists to retain their lives and their land. So all of the colonists that had French connections stayed around Detroit. Everything basically continued on. All the British asked was that the French nationals basically swear an allegiance to the crown, and everything was good. Pontiac was like, this isn't good. The commitment that he made to exterminating the British, not only from his land, basically the land around Detroit and for miles outward, but Pontiac at that time made a commitment to go and exterminate the great island of the British presence. A little quote here. But there was one who, standing aloof from the rest, shared not the general joy. And as the French colors were lowered from the flag staff, Pontiac saw in that act the downfall of Indian supremacy in America. So when the British walked into Detroit, took over the fort from the French flag came down, the British flag went up, and that was an ominous sign for Pontiac that he had to act upon that, because as long as the British were staying in North America, the Indians didn't stand a chance. He saw that It was kind of a prophetic vision that he had, and he was convinced that he was going to fix that issue. King George III, shortly after the war came to a conclusion, tried to make amends with the Indians and tried to put a plan in place that he could deal with all the French nationals that were still in North America. On October 7th, 1763, he issued the Royal Proclamation. But unfortunately, that proclamation would prove to be too little and too late, too ambiguous to make any inroads as to what was happening.
I said, so did we decide on anything? Are we getting Zaxby's?
I think it's gonna be a rotisserie chicken.
I don't know. I mean, I suggested it. Talon walked off complaining this sucks, and I didn't know what to do.
Okay. The Royal Proclamation intended to introduce policies to help assimilate the French underneath British control, underneath their rule. And the Royal Proclamation legally defined all of the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains as a vast Indian reserve. There were supposed to be no Europeans go past the Appalachian Mountains and start settling what would be Indian land. The Ohio country became, again, the bullseye of all aggression because the Ohio country was coveted heavily by the Europeans, and that Royal Proclamation turned out to be an absolute joke. The British colonists, they wanted to move west. They basically were angered and became very resentful of King George III. They defied his proclamation and began to pour into the Ohio country and everywhere to the west of the Appalachian Mountains by, it's just like somebody opened up a floodgate. They began to pour out there by the thousands of people. Pontiac and his allies had not been conquered. They had not swore any allegiance to the British crown. If they were to still hold any allegiance, it was still very sternly given toward the French, even though they were very upset with how the French basically capitulated overnight, at least in the area of Fort Detroit. The British, they had obtained a very vast and a very troubled realm whenever they inherited all the land that the French had claimed, which was a significant amount of acreage in North America. They had obtained this vast realm. There were a lot of tribes and they were thinly scattered all throughout the Northwest. And the British now had a very daunting task to try and, one, understand who all these peoples were, how they thought, how they interacted with each other and also with the Europeans. And in order for that to be better understood, they dispatched Sir William Johnson to Fort Detroit. And he went directly to Fort Detroit because that was basically the hub, that was the center as to where all the Indians were to congregate and think about what they were going to do as a unified group. Eventually, that would shift from Fort Detroit, once the British took over, down to Brownstown, which was one of our villages. Sir William Johnson had direct ties with the Iroquois Confederacy. Because of that knowledge, most of the tribes out west had nothing to do with him. They had no respect for him. So he went out there basically trying to make some great strides forward in the relationship, and it didn't happen. The two prominent tribes at Fort Detroit were the Ottawa and the Huron. As we can remember from the last couple of months, the Wyandotte had basically established themselves down along the Sandusky River in the Ohio country, and they left Fort Detroit pretty much to themselves. They tried to basically just establish themselves, do their own thing, began to put out there that they are Wyandotte, but they're still Huron, and basically create their own path. So they didn't have a lot to do with the politics that was happening in Detroit at that time. The Wyandottes of Sandusky and Detroit far surpassed the surrounding tribes in energy of character and in social progress. Their log dwellings were strong and commodious. Their agriculture was very considerable. Their name stood high in war and policy, and they were regarded with deference by all the adjacent Indians, except for one, the Ottawa. The Ottawa had no respect for us because we didn't have a whole lot of respect for them. And if you can remember from a couple of months, there had been a lot of little skirmishes that had been taking place up to this point between the Ottawa and the Huron. Pontiac was then the strongest, and he was the most influential chief of all the chiefs of the various tribes. His influence stretched far and wide. It went all the way to the southeast. It went far out to the Rocky Mountains. It went up into the plains of Canada. It actually extended all the way down into the part of the country that we're here at today, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas area. His reach was great and it was powerful. Pontiac, after he saw the capitulation of the French, he basically went out on a tour to recruit all the different tribes to align with him against the British. He personally invested a lot of his time and energy to go out and create an army. And he had learned from what Nicholas did. And if everybody can remember, Nicholas was the first to actually try and rebel against the French. He failed, but Pontiac looked at what Nicholas had done and tried to not repeat some of those same mistakes that were made. Unfortunately, as he began to progress in his alliance with all the other tribes, some of those mistakes were made. They're just inevitable. No tribe wanted to defy Pontiac. Pontiac had power. He had plentiful warriors. He had an alliance that all he had to do was basically speak what he wanted done, and it was done. He was the self-imposed authority at the time. He didn't like the Huron didn't like him, and it was the Huron who basically stood up and openly surpassed him in what would be their diplomatic prowess. And Pontiac didn't like it. He was openly jealous. He was unrestrained in his anger. He lashed out. He was vulgar. He was defiant, which was not helping to win the Huron over to his cause because they were still very reluctant to join him because of past histories. And Pontiac knew that if he was going to win this war, he needed our grandmas and grandpas. He needed to find a way to control his temper. He needed to find a way to woo the Huron back over to his alliance because he needed their military prowess. The numbers weren't necessarily something to his advantage. We didn't have that many warriors, but they were just phenomenal in what they could achieve. At Detroit, there were 2 Huron chiefs. And this is where it becomes interesting from our perspective. We had 2 chiefs at Detroit. One was Takei, the other was Tieta. And Takei supported Pontiac. Tieta opposed Pontiac, and his opposition to Pontiac was very public. And by this time, we are beginning to see that the separation of the Huron and the Wyandotte, as we saw just a few years earlier, was also beginning to show some little splits that were happening within that little alliance that still was in place with the Huron that stayed in Detroit. There were different policies, there were different politics, there were different views on life that were beginning to cause some little problems within the tribe. And those differences began to express pretty clear when the opinion of Takei and Tieta were voiced in support and opposition of Pontiac. Pontiac only could come up with one plan. He began to use some brute force and threats to ensure that the Huron stood as his allies. He basically defaulted to what the Ottawa had been doing for 100 years. He threatened to hurt, exterminate, kill, maim, destroy, whatever was necessary to get our grandmas and grandpas to support him. Pontiac threatened to kill Tieta and the whole of his band if they didn't join his rebellion. And a little side note, I like to throw these in from time to time, but the historian Lyman C. Draper speculated that, as you can see here, Takei was the Wyandotte chief named. Would anybody like to guess who? It's not been proven, but it's highly speculated that Takei is another one of our chiefs that we know by a different name. Would somebody like to guess who that chief might be?
Tarhe?
Tarhe, yes. There is a lot of speculation that Takei began to step forward as a young warrior, a young chief, and began to position himself very prominently within the tribe. And over time, his influence, even though it wasn't that great, initially began to build. And we know him today most likely by the name of Tarhe, which is going to be a topic of discussion next month. The Potawatomi chief, Nineveh, was a weak character and fell easy prey to Pontiac's seductive oratory. But the Huron presented a more complex problem to the wily schemer. The Huron were of two branches, which were led by Tekei and Tieta, the former a match for Pontiac in character, but the latter a shrewd, discerning man who was not persuaded to Pontiac's way of thinking. Consequently, the Ottawa chief had to be content with the aid of only half the Huron band, that under Tekei. So Tieta is our obstinate Wyandotte. He was threatened with his life. He was threatened with annihilation. He was threatened with humility. He was spit on. He was cursed. Anything that you could think of that Pontiac did, he did to Tieta. And he stood there unabated. He was obstinate. He had made up his mind. He knew what he was going to do, and he was unwavering to a degree. Got to the point where Pontiac was so intent at basically killing Tieta that he finally went over to Pontiac's cause. He finally submitted, but he did so very reluctantly, and he did it knowing that he had no other choice. It was either do it or die. To further complicate a complicated situation with potentially volatile implications, kind of shows you that this was getting very delicate and was very explosive what was happening in Detroit. The Wyandotte, who were trying to do their own thing down on the Sandusky River, they had a chief named Big Jaw. Big Jaw gets involved. He doesn't do a whole lot except come back from Sandusky to Detroit. And now he jumps in there because he fully supports Pontiac, because the British were starting to put pressure on the Wyandotte down on the Sandusky. Their newly chosen land, they were not just going to walk away from it. They were going to defend it at all cost. So the Wyandotte supported Pontiac. Big Jaw came up and he started giving a lot of pressure and a lot of insults on the Huron. He saw that they were kind of a little bit squirmy in their support for Pontiac, especially Tieta. And he was just relentless in trying to make Tieta feel bad and give full support to the untrustworthy British. And through the taunting of Big Jaw and also the threats of Pontiac, Tieta finally said, sure, I'll help. Then on May 7th, 1763, Chief Pontiac and his far-reaching Indian allies, they openly rebelled against British rule. The attack that we'll talk about next month was harmonious. It was instant and it was brutal. And we'll talk more about the details of what happened next month. But the last quote that I want to give is one that I have in my book, and I won't take the time to read it, but you'll get the slides, and it'll give you an idea of the personality of Pontiac and the personality of Tieta, and how they basically were two stern men who basically sat there and bumped heads like two bulls out in the middle of the Detroit wilderness. So next month, we pick up at the tail end of this with our first of two discussions next month, and we're going to talk about the Pontiac uprising and the implications that it had on what was about to take place, and that would eventually work into the American Revolution. And as always, there's the sources for this, and that's all for tonight. Anybody got a question, comment? And can't see the chats. There it is. Oh. Anybody have any questions? Okay,
Thank you, Lloyd. We have said it would be did we say it's the first Tuesday of the month?
yes,
But that's 4th of July this next month.
unfortunately it is, yeah. And that's a day that we shouldn't try and conflict anything with.
No.
I'm open for, I don't think I have anything in the evenings next month that I'm aware of, so we could do what everybody would feel best on that day. Obviously, we'll keep the last Tuesday of the month for Tarhay.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody changed their name. Back then, there were so many different names that the different individuals used. Sometimes the Europeans had a hard time understanding how the names were pronounced. If you look at the way a lot of them are used throughout history, they're interchanged with different spellings. So I don't think he changed his name. I think it was just the way in which history recorded the name. Because, you know, Tarhay, he's also known as the Crane. He is known by that quite a bit. So most of the different men and women at the time had multiple names that they went by, kind of depend upon the company they kept and the circumstances in which they were participating in. They were known by many different names, just variations of what they had got. We don't know if that is his clan name or if it's a chosen name or if it's a given name. We just don't know. But if we want to pick a night that we can do the discussion for Pontiac's revolt, we can maybe get that one chosen.
The second Tuesday is when we do beatings, so which we're usually done by 8 if you want to do that night, but it kind of makes for a pretty long evening. Would you be okay with doing like,
It's too much.
okay. So what about the first Thursday? So it'd be the July 6th.
I'd really not like to do that one. That's kind of the,
I'm taking the whole week off too.
Okay, okay.
six is one day that I celebrate every year. So I don't
Okay.
really do that on my birthday.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, maybe we want to celebrate it with you, Lloyd.
Yeah,
On the 10th, it's my birthday. So, how about you and I, get together, see when we can do it. When's best in July before we get to that last one.
yeah,
And we'll email everybody.
yeah, that works. Whatever day we feel is going to be good, then, you know, we'll do it.
Okay, that sounds great.
And then, of course, the 25th will be the one for Tarhay.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
I'm missing that one too. I'll be backpacking, but I guess I can
Oh.
watch recording.
Yeah. Where are you backpacking?
We're gonna backpack across Catalina Island.
Oh,
Fun.
that's